Welcome back to A Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. Is the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution the absolute supreme law of the land that cannot be defied? That's basically been the established understanding ever since 1958's Cooper versus Aaron, that if the Supreme Court says it is so, everyone must be bound to it. Every government official that swears to uphold the Constitution, everyone is completely bound to follow whatever the Supreme Court says the Constitution says, in perpetuity, until the court decides the Constitution actually says something else. We all kind of agree that the Supreme Court's ruling is the absolute law of the land and cannot be ignored. But what if the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution incorrectly? Should we all still collectively agree to be bound by an interpretation that we know to be wrong? The case that essentially established the Supreme Court as the final word on the Constitution and its meaning, and establishing their ruling as the absolute enforced law of the land, came from a good place, at least at the time. The governor of Arkansas had deployed the National Guard to stop black students from entering Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Brown versus Board of Education established that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, but clearly here was a state official openly defying that ruling. The courts clearly saw a need to establish a precedent that didn't leave the option open for states to simply delay enforcing or ignore entirely their rulings. So in a surprising show of unanimity, the entire nine-justice court agreed to sign on to an opinion that essentially said, ours is the final word, resistance is not an option, which is great when it's enforcing something good like racial integration, but what happens when it's used to enforce things that are a little less beneficial for the public good? Does Cooper versus Aaron truly cement the Supreme Court's decision as undefiable even then? All the way back in 1800, James Madison argued that state governments retained the authority to judge whether the constitutional compact had been dangerously violated by the federal government, and that authority must extend to violations by the judiciary as well as by the executive or legislature. So even in the very beginnings of our nation, there were questions whether or not the Supreme Court had the absolute final say on what the Constitution actually said or meant. Famously, Abraham Lincoln took a similar position when it came to Dred Scott in 1857. While he did accept that the court's ruling bound both parties in the case and that Dred Scott did remain enslaved, he refused to treat the court's reasoning as binding on the political branches, saying, if the policy of the government upon vital question affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decision of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. So there is at the very least historical precedent for it questioning whether or not the Supreme Court's decisions are universally unquestionable and must be followed no matter what, even when that decision goes against what is right. Dred Scott may have established that enslaved black people were not American citizens, but the Lincoln administration declared all free blacks citizens of the United States, and then signed the Act to Secure Freedom to All Persons Within the Territories of the United States, prohibiting slavery in any U.S. territory, essentially nullifying the Supreme Court's decision, because Lincoln saw Dred Scott for what it was: partisan judges that had abandoned constitutional interpretation for political advocacy, resulting in a corrupt ruling. And that is beginning to sound a little bit too familiar in the modern day. Just like all the way back in 1857, we have a Supreme Court that is completely controlled by politics, ruling based on politics, not on correct constitutional interpretation. The 6-3 ruling in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization that overturned Roe v. Wade and 50 years of legal precedent. The 6-3 ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin that created a constitutional constraint on state gun laws that one historian called one of the most intellectually dishonest and poorly argued decisions in American judicial history. The 6-3 ruling in Trump versus United States that gave the Supreme Court the power to decide on a case-by-case basis what presidential actions were immune from prosecution. All these cases have one common factor: all 6 Republican appointed justices in a majority, and all 3 Democratic appointed justices in a dissent. All very clearly politically motivated decisions aimed at extending Republican power and contracting Democrats' powers over as many facets of American society as possible. The court may be supreme, but it's also supposed to be politically neutral. And this current court very obviously is anything but. They're the same type of corrupt partisan court that Abraham Lincoln pushed back against over a century and a half ago. So just like Lincoln did way back then, it's time to find ways around those clearly partisan corrupt rulings. And it seems like the American people kind of agree. Only 44% express trust in the Supreme Court. 56% of Americans say they distrust the court. And unsurprisingly, those that say they do trust the court are unilaterally Republican, because of course they trust it. The court is doing the things that they want. They have no reason to distrust a court that is in league with them. And while we've all kind of been enculturated to believe that the Supreme Court's decisions are unquestionable and must always be followed, ironically, it's Republicans themselves that have shown that defiance to them is actually possible. Back in the beginning of 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that Texas should remove razor wire from its border. Texas Governor Greg Abbott decided to not only not do that, but he had more installed, and there were no punishment or repercussions for having done so. So if red state leadership is willing to defy Supreme Court ruling when it convenes them, it's time for the blue states to do the same. We've been made to view Supreme Court rulings as sacred, but that sacredness is only valid if the Supreme Court maintains its neutrality in its interpretations and rulings, and this court has very clearly shown that they've abandoned that entirely. So as a result, strict compliance to them must also be abandoned. So is the Supreme Court's rulings the absolute supreme, undefiable law of the land? Clearly not. Conservatives have defied it numerous times to preserve things like slavery, racial segregation, or things as petty as simply keeping razor wire on the border. But while defiance to the Supreme Court's judgments seem to have been mostly used to preserve and promote bad things, it doesn't have to. Defiance in the name of good seems not only justified, but necessary now. If the court is going to show us that it no longer wants to pretend to be neutral and is willing to be entirely partisan in service to the conservative, that is long past time for liberals to push back against them and do what they have to preserve equality and rights for everyone. Defiance is permissible or even moral if it's done for the right reason. And some might argue, well, that's just selective enforcement. You're just going to listen to the rulings that do the things you do like and ignore or defy the ones that don't. And while I guess that is sort of true, you have to look at what those rulings are actually doing. If it's rulings that are conveying rights or preserving the rights of individuals, those should be followed. If it's ones that are stripping away rights, limiting rights, telling people where they're allowed or not allowed to exist or whether they are people at all, those are the rulings that are allowed to be defied because they are wrong. When you look at it from that perspective, it's not all that hard to understand. Supreme Court rulings aren't sacred and unquestionable, but it's important to analyze why you're questioning them in the first place. If it is to do something bad, then that's not the same as defying their ruling in service of doing something good. This whole discussion was largely sparked by the recent Supreme Court ruling that effectively dismantled the Voting Rights Act and ensured that minority voters would lose a lot of their voice in elections. It was so obviously purely partisan and again came right down to that 6-3 split where it was all conservative judges going for it and the liberal judges dissenting. It was essentially handing Republicans the ability to cheat in elections that they were going to undoubtedly lose if they had been run fairly, and the electoral maps were drawn to properly give voice to minorities in those states. So if the Supreme Court is going to hand Republicans the chance to win by cheating and stripping minorities of representation, that sounds like a ruling that should be openly defied because it is very clearly done on partisan lines to push a political agenda aimed at hurting and disenfranchising the very people the Voting Rights Act was established to help, and many of which are the descendants of the very people Dred Scott intended to keep enslaved and designate non-citizens. If the court is going to show it is no longer interested in preserving the American values of freedom and equality, and have instead dedicated themselves to the opposite, and returning us to a time where racial oppression and disenfranchisement was a regular part of American life, they must be opposed, because their judicial supremacy cannot be allowed to be used for oppression and suppression, because those are unquestionably not American values, and not what the court is intended to stand for. They may call themselves Supreme Court justices, but if they stand in the way of justice, they have forfeited their right to be considered supreme, and justice must overrule the justices. Alright guys, that'll be it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time when I cut you off, another slice of news. And don't forget to rate and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find it.